Good evening, everyone. Benedict Lucca here, your friendly library director, reporting from, or no, excuse me, presenting, I've been told, presenting from the historic Harrison Room at the Redwood Library. As you well know, we have an expansive view of the humanities, the public humanities. So we're not just, gray-haired guys pawing leathery books, my people. But we also engage with the visual and the oral, A-U-R-A-L. And as you know, tonight we have Dr. Markward, who is very popular and a great guy and an incredible performer. It's amazing when you have a guide such as him to lead you through the thicket and have him point out the subtleties, the movements, the history, all of that, and it really enriches the experience.
Sorry, jumped the gun a bit.
As you know, Dr. Markward is a highly decorated musician and director of all sorts of things, former music director of Rhode Island Civic Chorale and Orchestra, notably. And tonight he is going to discuss Late Romanticism, Part 3, Liszt and Strauss, the tone poem and other forms. This is the concluding segment of his popular series, and it has been very popular, and it's been great for us. And we're certainly grateful to Dr. Markward for his always uplifting and informative lectures. I should mention several things real quick before we start. The Redwood is now open. We have new hours due to the COVID-19 restrictions, so it's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Saturday, 11 to 4. You must wear a mask, obviously, and but everything is operating as normal. We have a whole slate of lectures that are coming up that you'll be very happy about. And if you're not a member, why don't you help me out and go ahead and join? And also, this performance by Mr. Markward will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. So if you're not a subscriber, I would invite you to subscribe if you wouldn't mind. That would be helpful to the Redwood Library. If we can get 1,000 subscribers, we've got YouTube paying us money to help us. So, every little bit counts. So, without further ado, I want, I'm just the bread and the sandwich. And here is the meat, Dr. Markward. So here he is. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. I'll try to live up to, well, maybe not all of what you said, but a great deal of the stuff. Tonight, we're going to talk about mostly the tone poem or the symphonic poem. They're interchangeable terms. And we're going to zero in on two composers of that form, Franz Liszt and Richard Strauss, both not only advocates, but pioneers in the form, especially Liszt. In 1859, the critic Franz Brendel named the new German school, which essentially was the followers of Richard Wagner. And the three composers were primarily Wagner himself, Franz Liszt, and Hector Berlioz. Strangely, Liszt and Berlioz neither was a German, but they claimed a German spirit. And as is usually the case in these recent talks, they can trace their heritage back to Beethoven, who served as their model. There were two forms of music beginning about this time. There is the absolute music, which model, the greatest of which was probably Johannes Brahms. And by absolute music, we mean music that stands alone without any reference to another art form, a program, literary work. Of course, there is choral music, and the late Louise Cuyler, tremendous musicologist, said that once you add words to the notes, you're in essence establishing a program anyway. So we can go all the way back to Gregorian chant, perhaps even earlier, and trace the essence of program music back that far if you want to take her word for it. Mendelssohn, when we talked about him several months ago now, thought that music without words could stand alone, hence his Music Without Words series of piano pieces, but that the listener could establish a program within his or her own mind. Brahms, of course, is a staple, as I said, in the orchestral form as far as absolute music is concerned. The other side of this is the program music, and the four composers who brought this to the fore were Liszt, Bruckner, Wolf, and Richard Strauss. And we're going to find a solution to the dilemma as to how to deal with the orchestra when not writing, excuse me, a symphony. So they each found an individual solution to this dilemma, and it had great appeal with audiences. Hugo Wolf was primarily a songwriter, leader. Bruckner, of course, was a symphonist. Early on, he wrote a lot of sacred choral music. The last 30 years of his life was devoted to symphonic music, but his religious program shone through on all that he did, including in the symphonies. Strauss and Liszt, of course, are the prime movers in the tone poem realm. The audiences of the day had become steeped in classical music. If you remember back in the time of Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, and earlier, if you went to a program by one of those folks, you would hear primarily music of themselves or perhaps another living composer. Liszt, if you remember back to when we talked about him, began to use older musics on his programs, on his recitals. He was one of the world's great pianists of the time. And he brought Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, programmed pieces of them and others as well as his own absolutely flashy kinds of piano pieces, virtuosic in their construction and of course in his playing. His own works for piano, of course, are a contribution. His programming, his concerts with the classicists, forming thereby the modern day recital program. If you go to a concert or a program today, you're likely to hear an old piece, a middle old piece, and a new piece on the program. His other contributions are sort of fascinating. It took me to this talk doing some research on Liszt. I've always admired him as a composer, his piano works especially. But he was more than just a composer or a pianist. He was a composer, a music teacher, an arranger, organist, writer, philanthropist, Hungarian nationalist, and a member of the Third Order of the Franciscans. He was sort of a polymath, like a modern day Jared Diamond. Additionally, Liszt was a friend, a benefactor, and a music promoter of a host of composers of the day: Chopin, Wagner, Berlioz, Robert Schumann, Camille Saint-Saëns, Edvard Grieg, Glinka, and Borodin, and by extension, Mahler and Tchaikovsky. In his tone poems, he invented a thing called thematic transformation. That is, there is a particular theme, and we will hear it in two of his works tonight, and that theme is transformed depending on the mood that he is trying to create as he moves through this symphonic poem. A symphonic poem or tone poem is a one-movement work. He later wrote, a couple of symphonies, the Dante Symphony and the Faust Symphony, which are in essence each 4 tone poems glued together. He also contributed radical innovations in harmony. As we know, all these descendants of Wagner became great chromaticists, which means they can go to almost any key at any time at will. And in Liszt's case, there are few resolutions to major or minor chords. You go from one dissonance, one unresolved chord, to another unresolved chord. So you have a feeling of ongoingness, not a sense of repose very often. The program music, the symphonic or tone poem, is music intended to evoke extra musical ideas. And this all stems from Richard Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, in which literature, art, architecture, remember the Great Gate of Kiev of Mussorgsky, and personalities or literature may serve as the inspiration for the tone poem or the symphonic poem. In a letter to Madame Marie Dagoul, who was a friend, and I use quotes when we talk about Liszt, a friend of his, he wrote to her, "Musical works which are in a general sense following a program must take an effect on the imagination and emotion independent of any program. That is, that these works can stand alone as absolute pieces of music." In 1848, he retired as a touring pianist. In the 10 years following to 1858, he wrote 12 tone poems, and he focused almost completely on composing. Each is a programmatic work in one movement, and they are symphonic in sound, weight, developmental procedures, much as a sonata allegro form in the first movement of a symphony. It all goes back to Beethoven, as I have already stated. We're going to listen first to a piece called the Totentanz, or Death Dance. It was written in 1849, and throughout his life, Liszt had a fascination with death, heaven, and hell. This particular dance is based on the Dies Irae, which is one of the chants in part of the Latin Mass for the dead. He also wrote a piece called Thoughts on Death, another called Funerals, and one called The Lugubrious Gondola. I'm not quite sure what that one is about. What you will hear here is a back and forth between the piano and the orchestra, virtuosic piano playing, or a piano part, lots of scales, lots of arpeggios, lots of fast work, and then the Dies Irae itself. He begins with that Dies Irae right here. I'd like to play you the end because it's really a smashing ending to this piece. There's a piano cadenza and then back and forth again between the orchestra and the piano, and a very big ender, as we say. I'm sure you're dying to know who that pianist was. It was Christian Zimmermann with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, our own beloved Boston Symphony, with Seiji Ozawa as conductor. Liszt also wrote, as I said, many of these tone poems, 13 in all. Just to give you a sample, pardon me, of what they are about, one of the next ones he wrote was Prometheus, and it relates to the myth, as did Beethoven's ballet music. Here again, we go back to Beethoven. Orpheus, which is based on Gluck's opera plot, and Faust and the Dante symphonies, which I already have mentioned, which are multi-movement and essentially consisting of linked individual tone poems. Probably his most famous work for orchestra is a tone poem early on in this series of tone poems that he wrote. It was written in a 6-year span between 1849 to 1855. It's Les Préludes. And here you can see the thematic transformation as clearly as we did in the Dies Irae. By the way, you may know that Dies Irae theme for piano by another composer. Rachmaninoff used it in the variations on the theme of Paganini. These transformation of thematic material to reflect moods of the subject, and this follows in a way Berlioz's idea that we talked about a long time ago, the idée fixe, the single idea which ran through the whole Symphonie Fantastique and later Harold in Italy. Also, Wagner's idea of the leitmotif, except that the leitmotifs are assigned to particular characters or particular moods. In the case of this thematic transformation idea, we're talking about one theme used many, many times to elicit different kinds of moods. Here he is basing this poem. It's linked to a poem by Alphonse Marie Lamartine, and he follows the same general outline of the moods of the poetry in his symphonic poem. This is the opening of Les Préludes. Well, actually, I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's audible on Crowdcast. So we're going to try it some other way here. I'll move it ahead a little bit. The theme is three notes, dee da dum, and you'll be able to hear how he transforms that throughout the work. There it is. Becomes very lyrical here. Amorous, one might say. I'm going to cut to the end. Again, it's quite powerful. And you will hear this theme imposing itself toward the end incessantly. pretty powerful ending, I think. And always, if one does that on the second half of an orchestral program, you're almost assured of a standing ovation. Liszt's influence with this symphonic poem went even further than the people I mentioned earlier. Smetana, the great composer, Franck, Saint-Saëns, I mentioned, Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Strauss, of course, Jean Sibelius, and Charles Ives. Believe it or not, our own Charles Ives. If you recall the Holiday Symphony, maybe many of you don't listen to Charles Ives, but he's an important composer. The Holiday Symphonies, 3 places in New England, and then one of my very favorites, The Gong on the Hook and Ladder. We move now to Richard Strauss, who lived from 1869 to 1949. But in this particular talk, we're dealing with the symphonic poem or tone poem, and Strauss wrote all of his before 1900. He also wrote 16 operas, which are obviously a whole other talk, or 2 or 3. All but one of those were written after 1900, so we're going to save that for another time. He was a celebrated conductor, as was Mahler after him. He conducted in Munich, Weimar, Berlin, and Vienna, where he had positions. He conducted most of the world's great orchestras, including in the USA, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York City, and Pittsburgh. He was a composer in 3 genres: the tone poem, operas, in which he composed 16 operas, and then a host of lieder or songs. And that's the other in the title of the lecture this evening. I want to play a couple of his songs, which are actually apropos of what we'll be discussing in a moment. In his teens, Wagner heard the operas of Richard Wagner and also analyzed Tristan and Isolde. And so they were the chief models for program music were Liszt and Berlioz, and then Wagner with his chromaticism and the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, which we already mentioned. The audience, or the symphonic poems of Liszt and Strauss, found an audience because they were something new. Heretofore, you'd go to a symphony concerts, and this still holds true today to a large degree. You would hear an overture, a concerto, and a symphony. Well, now we have another alternative to that. We can do one of these tone poems, and they're weighty. They're about 20, 25 minutes long, some longer, and they can make up a whole second half of a symphonic program. Some of his are based on literature. Don Juan, which was his first, written when he was 24 years old, which is after a poem by Nicholas Lenau. Tod und Verklärung, or Death and Transfiguration, another poem. The interesting thing about this famous tone poem was that the music was written first, and then he hired Alex Ritter to write a poem to match what he had written and his thoughts about this piece. Macbeth, obviously after William Shakespeare. Also sprach Zarathustra, a philosophical novel by Friedrich Nietzsche. And The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, a novel by Miguel de Cervantes. And then he based a couple of his symphonic poems on his own experience. And the one, of course, which always smacks a bit of arrogance is Ein Heldenleben, which is presumably autobiography. Ein Heldenleben means a hero's life. Don Juan was a success overnight, and as I said, he was only 24 years old. It's a bit different than the Don Juan we find in the literature or in Mozart's opera, because this is a psychological treatment of a man in search of the ideal woman, rather than being soaked up with debauchery. The glories in the experience of the moment, according to Don Juan, until he discovers each successful exploit has led to harm in some way. So it makes his life increasingly burdensome, and at the end, and I can't play it for you because it's too soft. But just as he is about to slay the brother of one of his contests in a sword fight, he throws his sword away because he finds victory as boring as the whole of life. The opening of Don Juan is just an incredible exercise in virtuosity for every player in the orchestra. And then it's followed by the main theme, which is played by a violin solo. And yes, I do have a story about that. Maybe you've heard of the great conductor David Zinman, who just retired from conducting not long ago. Maestro Zinman was conducting Don Juan as a guest conductor with several orchestras in the US. And David Zinman had a very pleasing baritone voice. So as he was going from orchestra to orchestra, and when it came to the solo, the concertmaster would play the solo, and David would say, "I'd like it just a little bit this way," and he would sing it to him. So at about the fifth orchestra, who got word of this thing that was going on, when it came to that point, the entire first violin section stood up and sang this beautiful violin solo to Mr. Zinman. Here is Don Juan, Opus 20. As my friend Richard Cumming, the great composer, used to say, that's just yummy. We move on to a tone poem that he wrote at approximately the same time. Don Juan is Opus 20, which he wrote at age 24. The next is Death and Transfiguration, which is Opus 24, begun in his 24th year and finished in his 25th. And I've always been sort of curious about why one would be thinking about this at age 24. And then I remember that Leonard Bernstein's first symphony, the Jeremiah, was also written when he was 24 and also deals with death. Depicts the death of an artist, and it was described in a poem by Ritter after Strauss composed this work. And what you find in Strauss also is excellent writing for the French horn and for the soprano voice. When we get to that a little later, I'll explain it. His father was a first-class horn player, and his wife was a soprano. In this particular case, it could be the life of an artist. He's a sick man near death, and if you get a chance, I urge you to listen to the opening, because you will hear rather irrhythmically the heartbeat of a man who is very near death, an old man, and it is battle between life and death. The dying man's life passes before him. He thinks of childhood innocence, the struggles of manhood, the attainment of his worldly goals, and then ultimately the longed for transfiguration from the intimate reaches of heaven. Strauss said at age 25, "It occurred to me to present in the form of a tone poem the dying hours of a man who had striven toward the highest ideals and aims, maybe indeed those of an artist." And the reason later on I'm going to play one of his songs, or two or three perhaps, he used the transfigured theme in this work in his very last song, which is part of the four last songs. Actually, it's not quite true. He wrote one more after that, but it's not included in the four last songs. And on his deathbed, Strauss remarked that dying is exactly as I composed it 60 years ago in Tod und Verklärung. We're going to move into the middle of this piece, or sort of there, about a third of the way through, the trials and tribulations, and then we will hear the final transfigured theme. The innocence of youth. I think you could probably guess where the Transfiguration theme came in. It begins, "How dry I am," if you want to use something that's familiar. I want to play the end again, at least part of it, where he builds up to the final Transfiguration. And then please do keep this little theme in mind. Well, it's a big theme. And we'll hear it again in the last song. It's more heavenly this time. One thing I would like you to notice as we go through these late Romantic works, especially these chromatic pieces which stem from Wagner's vocabulary, is that there is seldom a sense of repose, a sense of rest. Once you think you are approaching a place to stop, the composer introduces a new theme which overlaps, or a new key which overlaps, and moves you onward until the very end of the piece. Next, I'd like to play for you the opening of Also sprach Zarathustra. And there's at the end of this introduction, there's a tremendous crescendo, and what's left hanging in the balance is the pipe organ. There's also a big solo in this opening for timpani. And I think you probably, I'm hopeful, if I can get it going here, you will probably recognize this. That's a low pipe on 32-foot stop on the organ to begin with. Also known as 2001, A Space Odyssey. I think, judging from the time, we'd better move on to these examples of songs that I'd like to play for you. The other tone poem that I had recording of for you tonight was Don Quixote. Don Quixote was Opus 35, and the full title is Don Quixote, Fantastic Variations on a Theme of Knightly Character. It's the same plot as Man of La Mancha. And it's for orchestra, solo cello, and solo viola. And if you can get hold of the recording by the Boston Symphony, conducted by Seiji Ozawa, the cellist is Yo-Yo Ma, and the violist is the longtime principal violist of the Boston Symphony, Burton Fine. I think we've got to move on, though. I want to play two songs from early Strauss, and then end with the fourth of the four last songs. It's just to show you that he had a great dexterity for keyboard. These songs you're going to hear in their orchestrated versions. But Strauss was able to really blend a wonderful piano part, and you will hear it in the orchestra, and wonderful setting of words. The first that I'm going to play for you is called Morgen, or Morning, tomorrow morning. And this is Opus 27, number 4. A wonderful introduction. The text is, "And tomorrow the sun will shine again, and on the path that I shall take, it will unite us, happy ones again, amid this same sun-breathing earth. And to the shore, broad, blue-waved, we shall quietly and slowly descend. Speechless we shall gaze into each other's eyes, and the speechless silence of bliss shall fall on us." The artists are the Gewandhaus Orchestra of Leipzig, conducted by Kurt Masur, with the marvelous, marvelous late Jesse Norman, soprano. Just gorgeous composition sung superbly. Strauss was asked by his son, after Strauss retired basically from composing, to write some last songs, which were with orchestra. They are the 4 last songs in name. They are Frühling, which is spring, September, which is September, Beim Schlafengehen, on going to sleep, and Abendrot, twilight. Although I think the depiction that the German gives us is more explicit than twilight, evening red. So we know that the sun is shining and about to set, that red halo that we see just before dusk. In the twilight, through adversity and joy, we've gone hand in hand. And this is a rather personal statement, although the poem is by Eichendorff. It's a rather personal statement by Strauss, I believe. I've had the privilege of conducting these wonderful songs 3 times, once with a very good friend and twice with my dear wife. And when you do it that way, they're sort of tough to get through because they're about leaving Earth, but together. Through adversity and joy, we've gone hand in hand. We rest now from our wanderings upon this quiet land. Around us slope the valleys, the skies grow dark. 2 larks alone are just climbing, as if after a dream, into the scented air. And you will hear the 2 larks ascending, portrayed by the 2 flutists. Come here and let them pour past, for it will soon be time to rest. We do not wish to get lost in this solitude. O wide, quiet peace, so deep in the red dusk, how weary we are of our travels. Is this perhaps death? And at that point, you hear the Transfiguration theme from Death and Transfiguration. Again, it's the wonderful Jesse Norman. That's all I've got for tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Markward, thank you so much. That was very, very informative always. The way that you splice bits of music and you know, these explanations are always amazing. I believe there is one question that I'm seeing here at the bottom of the screen.
What are you doing?
All you have to do is just click on it. Okay. No, there is no question. We'd like to invite you to come back next year. You know, next month even.
That would be terrific for me.
We always want you to come back because you know that the parsing, the expert parsing of these musicians and their music is, you know, I mean, that's what everybody needs. It's like going to the museum and having a guide or something.
It's great to see so many people still interested in classical music. It's wonderful. It gladdens the heart.
So thank you again. We'll talk very soon about you coming back for what would be, I believe, your 6th year. Is that true?
Correct. Yes.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you again. I'm going to take this moment to tell our audience members some of the things that are coming up. August 12th. A week from today will be John Church, former curatorial director at the PS, and he will be. This will be the part 1 of a 4-part series, Palaces of Repose, and the first one next week will be Drottningholm, the wooded realm of Swedish queens, and so. Every week for 4 weeks, John Church will explain and give us a slide lecture on each of these palaces, each of which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And as many of you well know, John Church is a real pro. So I think that's going to be very good. In many ways, parallel to Dr. Markward in the music realm, John Church is going to guide us through these amazing palaces. Meanwhile, we have, just so that everyone knows, we have a number of, on August 26th, we have Paul Glenshaw and the Lafayette Escadrille. If you remember, we did a small exhibition a few years ago, the Lafayette Escadrille being a crack team of Americans who fought with the French army in the very early years of aviation during World War I. One member of the Lafayette Escadrille, of course, Norman Prince, who has some roots right here in Newport. The bird sanctuary, for example, is named after him. Then there will be Jennifer Levitz on October 8th, who will speak on her new book called Unacceptable. Then on October 14, Bill Ludwig. He is a man who has been studying labyrinths all over the place. And it is going to be he's coming out with a new book on a labyrinth guidebook. And there's a number of labyrinths in Rhode Island and 2 in Newport. So I've asked him to give us a lecture and to focus on the Rhode Island labyrinths. I could go on, but please look on our website for more information. And that's about it. I want to thank you very much. And to all of the audience members, I hope that was as enlightening for you as it was for us here at the Redwood Library. And I will see you next week for John Church. Thank you very much to Dr. Markward and to our audience members. Thank you so much. Good evening.